And let's take that money and put some of it into energy research so we can get up to where we need to be, and use the rest of it to reduce the debt. So this is a good discussion and one I look forward to continuing, and I'm delighted I have a chance to continue it with someone I respect as much as the senator from California.
Mr. President.
Senator from California.
If I may, I want to thank the distinguished, ranking member, and I believe that completes the opening statements on the bill. And I notice that distinguished senators on the floor, so I think if it's agreeable with you, Senator Alexander, we can yield at this time to him. Great. Thank you.
President.
Senator from Indiana.
Mr. President, I didn't come to interrupt opening statements. I guess they're completed, and I do have a point that's directly related to a matter that's directly related to this particular appropriations bill, which I would like to discuss, and I'm going to put forward an amendment as a consequence of this. And so I'm glad that the chairwoman and the ranking member are here, so I can put this on the record, and they're familiar with what I'm going to do. This is a matter that's important both to my state of Indiana, and I believe the federal government's involvement in subsidizing or loan guarantees or other support for various energy development projects. All of us, I think, are concerned over the situation with Solyndra, where a $535 million loan guarantee from the Department of Energy to construct a solar panel manufacturing facility has now gone bust, and the taxpayer is on the hook for over $500 million of loan guarantee and money that's lost to the taxpayer. That money likely will never be repaid. However, my concern goes beyond Solyndra. I didn't come here to talk about Solyndra, but there is a similar situation that may be occurring, and I want to raise this issue because it goes again to decisions that are being made by the department's energy renewal offices relative to loans to private entities and loan guarantees to private entities. This particular situation involves the Advanced Technology Vehicles Manufacturing, or ATVM, loan program. Now, some of those loans are going to what may turn out to be viable improvements in our ability to lighten vehicles, to increase mileage, to provide for alternative sources of fuel. I think that's still up in the air and still to be determined. But this particular program that I want to talk about involves this program that I'm not sure fits within the proper category. Earlier this year, the department issued a nearly $750 million, $730 million conditional loan commitment to Severstal North America under the ATVM program. And let me read from the department's press release. Quote, "This funding will support the modernization of Severstal's existing facilities in Dearborn, Michigan, in addition to the design, manufacture, and construction of new facilities to produce the next generation of automotive advanced high-strength steel. The Severstal project has the potential to significantly increase the supply of this advanced high-strength steel in North America as demand continues to grow for fuel-efficient vehicles." Continuing the release. An increased supply for this breakthrough technology steel will help U.S. automotive manufacturers meet the pending and future design, weight, and safety requirements of advanced technology vehicles. Severstal estimates the project will generate over 2,500 construction jobs and over 260 permanent manufacturing jobs. End of quote. End of the department's press release. Now, the Department of Energy makes it sound like this loan to Severstal will promote a completely new breakthrough technology. The problem is that this simply is not true. In fact, 6 companies already manufacture the advanced high-strength steel that Severstal is seeking to receive a loan to help produce. 3 of those companies have production facilities in my home state of Indiana: ArcelorMittal, Steel Dynamics, and U.S. Steel. Evidence shows that the market for this type of steel is strong and robust in the United States, with multiple producers already manufacturing these high-technology products. In fact, I'm told that this high-strength steel has been manufactured in the United States since the 1980s, and the current capacity for this steel actually surpasses current demand. Now, all of this information should be available to the Energy Departments for their consideration as to whether or not they should go forward with this loan. But the department's spokesperson is quoted as saying that advanced high-strength steel is, and I quote, "in short supply." This begs the question as to whether the administration has seriously conducted any type of market analysis before deciding to award this loan. Did the department research what advanced high-strength steel products are already in the marketplace and whether a taxpayer loan was even needed? Based on the department's public comments, it seems unlikely that the administration made any estimates of current and future capacity in the United States for the production of this steel or talked to any steel producers outside of Severstal. I think a legitimate question is, what's the impact of this loan should it be finalized? Subsidizing Severstal to produce a product already being manufactured would undercut competitors, because Severstal, of course, will have lower costs due to the nearly $750 million loan guarantee. There's also no job creation here that fits the description of what the department indicated would be the case with new jobs. Given the state of supply and demand, any new jobs created at Severstal would come at a cost to other producers, creating at best a net zero job gain. That means job losses in Indiana and Pennsylvania, where the high-strength steel is currently already manufactured. Moreover, the department claims that over 2,500 construction jobs would be created by the issuance of the loan. Well, Mr. President, that claim is dubious at best, since most of the plant construction is already manufactured. Moreover, the department claims that Severstal's own documents claim that 2 of the 3 required lines will be finished by December 2011. Only an annealing line valued at 1/3 of the amount of the loan is awaiting for the final approval. And the department's own website states, quote, again, "loans will not be available on a retroactive basis." So here we have a situation where the department's own release and justification of the loan states a number of construction jobs to be put in play when the construction is virtually finished. And secondly, when most of the completion includes, with one exception, that only amounts to 1/3 of the loan that's being asked for, makes you wonder why the loan is 2/3 greater than that. And we have to ask the question, is it proper to give a company more than $750 million for facilities that have already been built, and for a production of a product that is already manufactured in an excess supply in the United States? And particularly 2 states that are impacted by this, the state of Indiana and the President's state of Pennsylvania. So here we are, back in a situation in which the federal government is picking winners and losers in a fully functioning and growing product market. Based on these concerns, Mr. President, I sent a letter to the Department of Energy, Secretary Chu, in June, seeking answers to a number of these questions that I've been raising. Unfortunately, the department sent back a very non-responsive reply that did not address any of my concerns. And as a result, I believe it's necessary to call on the Inspector General of the Department of Energy to investigate the Severstal loan and report back to Congress his findings. American taxpayers deserve to know what is happening with our tax dollars, and the hardworking employees of other steel companies manufacturing the same steel deserve to know why the Department of Energy is attempting to undercut their job security by subsidizing a competitor. So today I'm introducing an amendment to the Energy and Water Appropriations Bill that would direct the Energy Department's Inspector General to submit a report to Congress on the conditional loan agreement currently in play to Severstal. Such a report by the Inspector General can help clarify why or why not this conditional loan to Severstal should be granted. The Department needs to be more transparent and forthcoming with how it is using taxpayers' dollars. We need to learn lessons from the disaster that is Solyndra and the cost to the taxpayer. And the last thing I would think the Department of Energy, this administration, or this Congress needs to do is to authorize nearly $750 million loan for a product that is already being manufactured by domestic energy suppliers and is not needed. We need that determination, and that's why I'm offering this amendment. Mr. President, if time permits, I would also like to step aside from the current topic to briefly discuss another matter. If I don't want to exceed a time limitation that might be in place, but it appears that I can go forward with that without a problem. Mr. President, I also want to discuss the subject of a vote last week by UNESCO, the United Nations Education, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, to grant membership to the Palestinian Authority, even though it is not a recognized country. UNESCO really should not have the authority to do so, but through a vote in the United Nations, it did just that. The United States has been an on and off supporter of UNESCO. It's been a lot of controversy with UNESCO over its lack of effectiveness, the cost to the taxpayer, its appointment of some highly questionable heads of various entities of UNESCO, leading the human rights office. I think the country of Libya had that leadership at one point, and it has resulted in responses and questions as to whether we should continue funding that organization. We currently support that. But this action that has been taken to admit the Palestinian Authority as a member state is, I would submit, completely misguided and very deeply damaging. UNESCO's decision has further dimmed prospects for a negotiated peace in the Middle East. My fear is that this step, which the Palestinians mistakenly regard as a success, will encourage them to press for membership in other UN bodies as well. Doing so will harm Israel, harm the Palestinians' own interest, harm the UN agencies involved, and damage our own national interest. As a consequence of this action, the U.S. is obligated. I want to point out to my colleagues, it's important that we understand that as a consequence of the action taken by UNESCO, the United States is obligated under law to terminate all funding for UNESCO and any other UN body that admits the Palestinian Authority. Public Law 101-246, which passed in 1990, states that, and I quote, "No funds authorized to be appropriated by this act or any other act shall be available for the United Nations or any specialized agency thereof which accords the Palestinian Liberation Organization, the PLO, the same standing as member states." That, Mr. President, is the law. That is what has been enacted through votes in this body and signed by presidents of the United States. In 1994, Congress passed Public Law 103-236, which prohibits, and I quote, "voluntary or assessed contribution to any affiliated organization of the United Nations which grants full membership as a state to any organization or group that does not have the internationally recognized attributes of statehood," which the PLO does not have. The Senate, on a vote codifying this information, or codifying these laws, or reaffirming, I should say, passed this legislation 92-8, indicating that this is clearly should be a non-controversial and nonpartisan issue, a 92-8 vote. The reason I'm speaking here today is that despite our legal obligation to suspend funding as a result of UNESCO's latest action, there have been some discussions, some speculation, that it may be possible to find alternative ways to financially support UN agencies like UNESCO that have taken this step of admitting the Palestinians as a member. That would be a total mistake. And I want to reiterate the fact that it would be a violation of the law. And so therefore, I come to the floor today to introduce a bill that serves as an emphatic restatement of that law, making its consequences more certain. Furthermore, I'm introducing this language as an amendment to the current appropriations bill that will clarify that no taxpayer dollars can be used to fund UNESCO. We must slam the door on any speculation of any kind of backdoor financial support for the United Nations or the United Nations agencies that grant membership to Palestine. This bill does exactly that. There is no reason, or this amendment, I would say, there is no reason why this purposeful restatement of existing law should not have bipartisan support. The threat to prospects for a negotiated, just, and lasting peace that is posed by this recent Palestinian tactic is more tangible now than in the past, and our determination to discourage such a dangerous tactic should be stronger than ever. I ask that my colleagues join in support of this legislation that makes it clear to UNESCO and to the United Nations, and clear to Israel, clear to the Palestinian Authority, and clear to the rest of the world that the United States will not tolerate attempts to admit the Palestinian Authority and undercut negotiated peace efforts in the Middle East. I'm hoping, Mr. President, we will have a vote on this to once again reaffirm our determined commitment to live by the laws that we have passed and to not allow an agency of the United Nations or any part of the United Nations that is used to grant statesmanship and nationhood to an entity that has not qualified for that. And I hope that this reaffirmation will also put to rest any speculation or any attempts to circumvent the laws that exist on the book. With that, Mr. President, I yield the floor.
I note the absence of a quorum.
The clerk will call the roll.
Mr. Copeland. Mr. Alexander.
Consent the call of the quorum be terminated.
Without objection.
I now ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to period of morning business and is allowed to speak for up to 10 minutes each.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent the Senate proceed to executive session to consider the nominations on the Secretary's desk in the Coast Guard. I ask that the nominations be confirmed en bloc. The motion to reconsider be considered made and laid on the table with no intervening action or debate, and that no further motion be in order to any of the nominations. Any related statements be printed in the record, that President Obama be immediately notified of the Senate's action, and the Senate then resume legislative session. I ask unanimous consent the Help Committee discharge from further consideration of SRES 199.
The clerk will report.
SRES 199, supporting the goals and ideals of Crohn's and Colitis Awareness Week.
Without objection, the committee is discharged and the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask further that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, the motion reconsider be laid on the table, there be no intervening action or debate, and any statements related to this matter be placed in the record at the appropriate place as if given.
Without objection.
I ask consent that the Senate proceed to SRES 322.
The clerk will report.
SRES 322, designating November 2011 as COPD Awareness Month.
Without objection, the Senate will proceed to the measure.
I ask unanimous consent that the resolution be agreed to, the preamble be agreed to, and the motion reconsider be laid on the table.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that we, as in executive session, that the injunction of secrecy be removed from the following treaty transmitted to the Senate on November 14th of this year by the President of the United States. Agreement on port-state measures to prevent, deter, eliminate illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing, which is document number 112-4. Document 112-4. I further ask that the treaty be considered as having been read the first time, that it be referred with accompanying papers to the Committee on Foreign Relations in order to be printed, and that the President's message be printed in the record.
Without objection.
I ask unanimous consent that when the Senate completes the business day to adjourn until tomorrow morning, 10 a.m., that's Tuesday, November 15th. Following the prayer and the pledge, journal proceedings be approved to date. The morning hour be deemed expired. Time for 2 leaders be reserved for use later in the day. Following any leader remarks, the Senate be in a period of morning business till 11 a.m. The senators permitted to speak for up to 10 minutes each, with the time equally divided and controlled between the new leaders or the designees, with the majority controlling the first half, Republicans controlling the final half. Following morning business, the Senate proceed to executive session. It's provided for in the previous order that following the votes in executive session, the Senate recessed until 2:15 to allow for the weekly caucus meetings, and at 2:15 the Senate resumed consideration of H.R. 2354.
Without objection.
Senators then should expect 2 roll call votes at noon. These votes will be in confirmation of Sharon Gleason, be a district judge for the District of Alaska, and Yvonne Rogers, be a district judge for the District of Northern California. There's no further business to come before the Senate. I ask it adjourn on the previous order.
Senate stands adjourned until 10 a.m. tomorrow.
One of them definitely.